Welcome, everyone. This is the September installment of Textile of the Month series. Today, we'll be talking about Kingoma. Okay, so let's go ahead and get started here. And Kingoma basically means couching. Okay, the definition is a little bit different than English, but couching works well enough. The idea of couching is that the thread usually heavier than normal thread. The head thread is sitting on top of the fabric and is held against the fabric with another thread. Okay, so the first thing you're going to do is set up a traditional embroidery stand. They don't use embroidery hoops the way we might, or they don't use a quilting stand the way we might for some things. Instead, the fabric, the entire bolt is lashed to this frame, and it's lashed by stitching it the way you see this gentleman doing. Okay, so it's actually stitched through the selvage edge on both sides and pulled taut like a trampoline. And then the other ends of it, there's the bolt end, which you see, which you'll see in a moment. Okay, here he is stitching. And so you can see just setting up is quite time consuming. The entire bolt is set up at one time. It's not cut into pieces. So you'll see the rolled bolt here on our left and the beginning of the bolt on our right. So it's a little bit, if you think about how a loom has a back beam and a front beam and then is rolled as progress is made, that's what he's going to be doing there. So he has to stitch and unstitch each section to make progress as he rolls it up and on the opposite side. So here you see with Kingoma, this is typical. So let me get a good shot here. What she's doing is laying this heavier threads. In Japanese Kingoma, usually it's 2 threads at a time as opposed to single. Okay, it gives a little bit nicer flow. And so if you'll watch, the little spool is called koma. Okay, and what she's doing is pulling it to help direct the trajectory of the thread on top. And then she's using a needle and thread with a finer thread to stitch it down. The thread that's used to stitch it down in this case is a yellow to go with the gold. But you know, when you're doing gold, quite often red is also used. And I'll show you a contrasting view of that in just a little bit. This is quite time consuming. She doesn't work as fast as is presented here. This is sped up double time. Okay, so she's not that fast an embroiderer. You have to take your time, be very meticulous with this. So this is the red I mentioned. This is an obi. The entire piece in this case has Kingoma couching on it. And in this case, the embroiderer chose, let me stop for just a minute, chose 2 different color threads to hold the larger thread down. So the tacking thread, in the case of the body of the phoenix, is done with red. The tacking thread in the case of the flower, the paulownia leaf that she's holding, and then also some of the tail feathers were done with a paler color, perhaps white or yellow, most likely yellow, to give a little bit more life to the body, a little bit more fire-like quality to the phoenix itself. And here you can see the details. Okay. Also, what I'll ask you to notice now, because I'll be pointing out something in a little bit, notice how, for the most part, the threads don't overlap. It starts, as you saw a moment ago, at one point on the outside, and then gradually spirals around to the very middle, and any end that might be cut is poked through the cloth to the other side, so you never see any raw ends to the thread. The way that the thread for Kingoma is normally made is there is a core fiber, often silk or usually rayon though, that's wrapped with strands of gold foil. Other things too, it can be silver, some other types of metals, but usually gold or silver. And that foil, when snipped at the end, will unravel. Okay, and that's why you want to be sure it's tucked through to the back of it. Now, in this case, you can see, because this is a peacock feather and there's some very delicate flowing strands, you can see how some of the strands are overlapping the other couching. You don't see that real often, but in that case, it was quite visually effective. This is another obi from my collection. The entire piece is kinkoma. However, what I'll ask you to notice is that there are some variations in it. This would be called kinkoma, okay? So all of this is couched with one thread. The couching in the background with the two parallel threads is yet a different thread, a different thickness. The outline of the cloud is done with yet a thicker strand laid down. But if we look down towards the bottom here, we can see that's not metal at all. Okay, it's not gold or silver. They are twisted silk threads. However, it still falls within this couching category because they are one thread is laid on top of the fabric and is held down with another thread, which is the definition of couching. Okay. You'll find those mixed quite often, and you'll also find kinkoma mixed quite a bit with embroidery. So if we look at this bottom section here now, this is gold, of course. This particular line is kinkoma. You can see the thick strands and you can see the little tiny bits of red tacking them down. These strands, however, are actually simply gold embroidery. So gold thread, similar to what I described a moment ago, but very, very thin, is used in an embroidery style where the gold thread itself in the needle is poked through to the back, brought up, poked through, brought up, and no additional thread is used other than the single strand piercing the surface. Okay, so it's not unusual to combine embroidery with kinkoma, even if they're all metallics. And in that case, it's often mistakenly referred to as kinkoma also. Now, there's a more dramatic version of it. What I showed you just now were examples on obi. I'll show you kimono in a moment. But there are more dramatic versions, such as the type of carts that are used in ceremonies in Kyoto and other regions of the country. So all of this gold on the dragon has been couched down, using exactly the same techniques we just saw. That applies to the tiger here as well. So you can see a great deal of padding and relief is added under the couching. And this is the manner in which, so you can see here the dragon we were just looking at on the side of the cart, okay, omikoshi. This is more of a neighborhood style omikoshi. They're smaller. For the larger festivals like Gion Matsuri, huge carts are used. So here's a fellow working on a new tapestry for one of the Gion Matsuri carts, and he's laid his thread down. Now, in his case, he's laying a gold couching thread down, and he's holding it in place with another gold thread. And what that does, as opposed to the red or yellow thread, it gives additional sparkle to it. So in the course of this video, he's describing working on this. He can usually get about half a feather done in a day if he starts at 7 o'clock in the morning. And then what it says here in the characters, it says that the fabric, rasha, that he's using is really stiff and hard, thick, okay? So it's really hard for him to sew through. But rasha, he might be using a contemporary version of it, but real rasha is yak fur felt from the Himalayas, okay, which was an extremely exotic import and a very luxurious item, and that was what was used on these carts. The carts were used to symbolize either the patrons or the town's wealth at the time. So they put out their very, very best. Often you'd see Persian carpets, hand-knotted Persian carpets, which were also extremely exotic and rare, hung in the same manner. Okay, so you can see him poking up his needle from beneath, pulling through and pushing the needle back down again to hold his gold heavier cord in place. Okay, and of course it's combined with other embroidery techniques as well to create a really lively three-dimensional effect on this tapestry. And we know that the spool he's using here, the koma, has the couching thread. These other spools on the right are the stitching thread. He has pliers here because sometimes the fabric is so stiff and it's so layered that he needs the pliers to both push the needle up through as well as to pull it down back to the backside. Okay, now if we look at the backside, he also, I'm stopping for a minute. If we look at the backside here, we see that he has a frame a little bit similar to the traditional embroidery one that we saw earlier. Okay, this is a little bit more sturdy for a heavier piece. And we also notice that the back is white, whereas the top was front. So when he's talking about it being difficult to stitch through the rasha felt itself is not terribly, I mean, it's like felt, it's not really stiff. So my guess is that he has the felted rasha piece in red backed with a canvas of some sort to give support as it's hanging in these carts. And that's the stiff part, not the rasha itself. Okay, so you can see combinations of kinkoma as well as embroidery, lots of very vivid colors to give a lot of life to our phoenix here. Okay, and this is what the finished piece looks like. This isn't in really good focus. I'm sorry, it was the best one I could find. And it's actually in one of the festival carts at the moment, the one that he was designing for. Now, these are quite tippy and quite tall, as you can see, not much OSHA approval here. But these carts are dragged through the streets. And in the old days, they used to actually do battles. So if you think of fighting kites in the sky, where you have these beautiful kites, yet they're doing battle and someone loses their exquisite kite. Same thing with these carts. They would do battle, turning these narrow streets, and often they would tip over in the course and have to be righted. And so quite a bit of flamboyance, quite a bit of competition went into these festivals in the old days. Now, this is a chart I pulled up from one of the websites, and what it's telling you is that this is hand embroidery, Kingoma style embroidery, so they're counting it as an embroidery technique. The top one is the front side of the fabric. The bottom one is the back side of the fabric. Okay, and so you can see here very clearly that there are two strands of cord resting on the surface, held down by the vermilion colored threads. And on the back, you can see how these vermilion threads pierced through the fabric, went back through the top to grab hold of the cord, and were stitched back through the bottom. So the bottom usually looks just a little bit sloppy in this way, or like chicken scratches, whereas the top is quite beautiful and neatly lined up. Okay. Okay, and so we'll pull. Okay. And so with this one now, what we have is a dragon from my collection. This is an altarpiece. And so it's very similar to the type that we did, that we just saw for the large carts. It's just a smaller scale. This one's about 3 feet across, maybe. But again, it's couching, and you can see the very heavy texture of all of this. At some point, I'll do a little class for you on how to make the bloodshot eyeballs for the dragons. Okay, that's a fun little technique. So if we stop for a moment and look at this, this is embroidery. Okay, this is machine embroidery that I want to help demonstrate the contrast with the hand couching. And here on computer graphics, he's plotting the path of the needle for the machine embroidery. The characters say kinshi, which means gold thread for couching. And this is how the gold metallic embroidery would be done. This is sped up double time. Okay, so this is plotted in this case with the computer. They can spell out anything that they like with it. It's very quick. They are using gold threads in some cases, other times imitation gold. This is also quite expensive. I'm showing you this because there's a tendency for us to think of machine embroidery as some lesser art. It's not. It is different than kinkoma, of course, in terms of perceived value, but they are very expensive and very highly sought after by very skilled artists. This is a computerized version, but there are others that are not computerized, and a truly skillful operator does not lose out to the computer in accuracy. Okay, but the look is different. This still has an embroidered look. So now by contrast, I want to show you this piece from a kimono. This is done the same way, but by hand. So this is all embroidery, it's not couching. Notice the lovely touch, though, of the colors that are added in between, very subtle. All of this is embroidered through. Okay, it's not couched. And so I'm just showing you, and then there's some cut work at the bottom that you can see. I'm just wanting to show you the contrast. Okay. Okay, and this is on silk, of course. And you can see that some of the metallics are tinted, sort of rose gold color and so forth to go with the pattern and create some energy within the piece. Okay, and again, this is from a kimono. This one is Chinese embroidery that I was just showing you. Now, I'm including Chinese embroidery because you find it very often used in Japanese kimono. The Japanese love Chinese embroidery. It's a style that the Japanese themselves don't practice, but it is quite popular, and it's a little bit hard to tell the difference sometimes between the Japanese and Chinese if you're not more familiar with embroidery. But generally speaking, the Japanese do a lot of hand couching. They do a lot of exquisite hand embroidery. The Japanese and Chinese both have a tendency, when not metallic, to use more flossy kinds of threads rather than the more twisted type that we find in the West. Okay, so the characters here just basically tell you that this is a Chinese art piece. It's hand embroidered in China and so forth. And these labels come with the garment when you buy them. It's the leftover fabric when the kimono is sewn. So if I've mentioned this in the past, but when you're buying kimono from antique stores, vintage stores, or thrift stores, always check the sleeve. Reach inside, feel if there's anything in there. Quite often there's some paperwork. If you have an exquisite kimono of your own, you purchased it new, it's very valuable, it's your family treasure, then when you buy the bolt to be tailored to your size, you buy the entire bolt. You get remnants, every little bit of remnant is returned to you with the finished kimono. Those remnants, especially the end of the bolt that has the label on it, such as the one we just saw, when you're not wearing the kimono, when you're putting it away, that gets tucked in the sleeve so that you will always have the provenance of this treasure um, kept safe with the kimono itself. So here's another version. This one is machine couching, and this one is also done in China. And one of the things I'd like to point out here, which is different than the Japanese hand couching, is that when this starts, let's follow this. See how this is overlapping and meandering and going along, creating a beautiful pattern, but nonetheless, it's one continuous strand that they're sewing rather than stopping, ending abruptly at one edge, and then continuing on. This is more like a snail trail of patterning. It's easier to do with machine this way rather than continually stopping, cutting, pushing to the back, and so forth as you do with hand. And this one also has a little bit of color. Now, one of the things we can tell is that this pink shading was added after the piece was couched. And you can tell that because the stitched down threads here are the same pink as the background, whereas they were applying silver. And by the way, when it's silver couching, it's called ginkoma, G-I-N. Gin means silver, as opposed to Kingoma, which we started out with, which is K-I-N, meaning gold. Kingoma is gold couching. Ginkoma is silver couching. And then there are other types also, lacquer and so on. But again, because this machine is using white thread to tack down the silver strands, when they were all through, they went back with a brush and softly layered in this little bit of pink for variety. But it was done after the couching was finished. You can see a little bit of blues, purples, greens, and so forth also for a very delicate finished piece of what's called hanaguruma, or flower cart. Okay, and here's some more Japanese couching. Um, very simple pieces, the butterflies with the focus placed on the center one with the additional embroidery.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay. And I wanted to show you this piece because this is not couched at all, nor is it embroidered, okay? What we're looking at, and I actually didn't even notice that this wasn't couched until I was doing the photography. I've had it for a long time and I just assumed it was couching and went about my business. But when I started doing the detail work, I saw that this is not thread at all. This is basically like an acrylic coat that has been squeezed on the cloth, a little bit like you do the tsutsugaki, the cone drawing that we do with rice paste resist. So a tool like that was used to apply this more latex-like line. So it has thickness, it has color, but it is not stitched down. And then these little tiny red sections that appear to be thread aren't thread at all. They're actually just painted on to make it look like it. It's a little bit more obvious right here in the stonework. Okay, so let's take a little bit closer look at this. And see right along this line as an example, you can see that the red thread doesn't even go to the other side. Okay, now that we're looking at it, okay? But for that very reason, and I'm certainly guilty of this, as I said, I've had this for years and years and years, and always just put it in the Kingoma pile and went about my business thinking it was very beautiful. So even specifically looking at it, it fooled me in that sense. And the Japanese are very, very good at creating imitation things that are very beautiful to fool the eye and to be able to sell it for a little bit less money. Okay. And here you can see they've even gone to the trouble of changing the color of the little slashes of paint to give you gold thread, a seemingly gold or yellow thread, and in other cases, seemingly red thread. Okay, now this one I want to show you because kinkoma can be used in many different ways. This one is a little bit unusual in that this is a two-layer garment called muso. It's a haori, and muso is a type of garment where the lining and the outer fabric are all one piece of fabric, one long piece of fabric, and it's sewn so that when you start on the inside lining, you go down the front, back up the front, over the shoulder, and then up the back lining, and there's an inside seam at the shoulder on the lining, but there is no seam at the hem usually, and there are variations of that. But the idea is this is the same fabric, lining and outer. It's all dyed with the same dye at the same time. And in this case, what they did on the lining side, they dyed this white crest called hanamoko. It's a melon blossom. And then on the top side, they couch the thread to match up with it. Okay. So, and because it's a lino weave, you can see through the fabric, and because it's black, it's even more pronounced. So in this case, excuse me, let me back up just a speck here. So in this case, they're not using gold or silver, they're using black lacquered thread. But because it's couched down the way it is, it still falls in the general category of kinkoma. So kinkoma means gold couching, but it's also the term used more generically to include everything that falls within the couching realm. So this is a shot of the inside lining. This is what you would see if you held the garment up and looked. And it's this white, very stark pattern that's showing through the outer layer of black that has the couching. Okay. And this again is ginkoma couching. This is for an obi. Obviously hand done, very nice quality, Japanese. And this is the piece that is in your sample collection today, or some versions. Some of you may have ginkoma, some of you may have kinkoma, but this is a beautiful sample of delicately stitched couching. And the piece I want to show you now is the one in back of me. This is called a suso hiki type of kimono. Suso means hem, okay, and hiki Hiku means to drag something. Okay, and so this is the type of kimono that you would see in older woodblock prints where the kimono hem is dragging behind the woman. Okay, this is extra long to drag. So it's not something, although this is a reasonably contemporary piece within the last 50, 60 years, it's not ancient. Okay, so these are still used by theater performers, by oiram, by entertainers in other situations, dancers and so forth, where you are performing with the kimono dragging behind. So let me give you a little bit more detailed look of this. This is an interesting piece because it's more of an Edo style of dyeing in which the couching and embroidery is combined with what seems to be kanoko shibori, but it's not. This is all hand painted with a small brush. All of these lines are painted in to imitate kanoko deer spot shibori, which we've done in another class, right? But this is not. It's just borrowing the beauty of the tie-dye. It's not necessarily less expensive, okay? It's just a different look. And then you can see the couching that's used to highlight different segments of it. Again, hearkening back to an Edo style of kimono patterning. And here's a little bit more. Now, this particular piece, okay, the tassel is an embroidered piece, and you can see that if the clarity is on your machine there by the slash stitches. Okay, so that's embroidery, whereas the Polonia leaf here has couching around it. A very different look. And the beautiful satin stitch of embroidery around the other items. Okay, and there is another section there that has wisteria with every single blossom of the wisteria stitched around. Other areas are hand painted with dark lines in indigo to give them accent. Okay, so let's see, let's put a stop share here. Okay, that concludes today's talk. And so I'll go ahead and sign off here and we'll go ahead with our class discussion. So if you'd all please put your speakers back on, we can go on with question and answer.